Well, hello people, and welcome to yet another edition of Ask Mark Live. Today's question comes from Western Australia. The market is a little bit tough over there, and it comes from one of our attendees to the List and Sell Tour, Bo Bremer, who is, I guess, doing well as real estate standards go. Now toting, sort of 3 or 4 listings a month. And his question went pretty much like this. He said, look, how do you actually get, Mark, inside of the List and Sell Tour? You're often talking about moving from, the 3 or 4 or 1 listing a week to 2 listings a week, but, eventually getting into these double figures. That is a quantum leap. And I said that, look, the subject was actually brought back to my attention when there was a video that Bo had done of him in a bathtub, and I know these videos are good for promo, but, my question was, what about leverage into other listings? And that's what prompted Bo to come back at me and say, well, where are you going with it? And there was another quote that jumped on there, and he just kind of mentioned the fact that, some people talk about overpricing. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that overpricing is, in my opinion, in the real estate business, a complete myth. Well, what I mean by that is that we get too hung up on price. So the question that I'm going to answer is kind of in tandem with this. I'm going to talk about the difference between comparative value and market value, and let me tell you, they are two worlds apart, and how you can utilize these to become a unique selling proposition. I must say that fundamentally, the difference between ordinary agents and great estate agents at the end of the day is a sound understanding of this. In fact, what I'm looking to explain or share with you today is that very difference. And, not wanting to boast, but myself, I was doing 10 to as many as 12 listings a month and averaging up around 10 sales at the peak of my career. And this was achieved by ignoring price altogether, yet I find that real estate agents have a terrible preoccupation with this. So let's just deal with this quantum leap thing. So what I said to Bo is, I said, look, yes, the quantum leap from low productivity to fulfilling one's capacity, and I'll come back to that in just a second. Capacity is a very important thing. I think these things can be answered in tandem with you, with the overpricing question, and because they're somewhat related. The fact that we get hung up on price. I believe getting too hung up on price is a blockage to productivity, and I'll explain as we go. So the first thing I want to say is that when it comes to the quantum leap, you really have to stop focusing on what you're doing and focus on what might be. You see, capacity is what you are capable of, and the numbers that you are doing, well, that's reality. And reality kind of gets in the way of capacity. You see, I don't suggest that a salesperson necessarily needs to go for 7 figures in GCI, nor do they need to do these, numbers that have them ahead of the pack. But I do believe you owe it to yourself to fulfill your capacity. Do what you're capable of. And my research has shown, and this is going to come as a bit of a knock to some people that have entered the world of getting PAs on board. My research has shown that the wheel spinning level for an individual salesperson in terms of productivity is around about 12 listings a month and about 8 sales. Now, some of you might be sitting there just freaking out, but I'm talking about you being able to do these numbers without having to bring on board a PA. Now, for many reasons which I can't cover here right now, I've seen good salespeople bring on PAs, and this has thwarted their productivity, not actually improved it. So the good news, if you decide to take it on board with what I've just said to you, is that you can be doing 12 listings and close to 10 sales per month without bringing on a PA. Now, part of this is really related to focusing on the right end of what I call the production belt in real estate sales. You see, there's many things that get in the way, but at the end of the day, if you look at the functionality of a real estate salesperson, it works pretty much in this order. Prospect, so we need to be bringing in new prospects daily. Fundamentally, what I refer to, if you've looked at any of these other recordings, I say that you need to be focused on active property sellers. So when I'm talking about prospects, I'm talking about those that are listing their property now or imminently. Secondly, to list those properties, and a lot of what we're just about to talk about has a strong correlation to that, because I believe, and always have done, that any problem that occurs inside of a real estate transaction typically emanates from the listing presentation itself. So we have to have a listing presentation that sets the stage or sets that listing up to be sold under the right terms, conditions, and the way we want them to, and then of course providing us leverage to move into other listings. So when we look at that prospect list, the third function is to manage their expectation. And we refer to this in the List and Sell tool as R2S, which stands for reduce to sell. Because quite often in managing their expectation, it is about reducing their expectation on price, typically the asking price, to a point where you're actually getting offers and you can indeed sell the property. Now, some of you might be sitting there saying, hang on, didn't he just talk about ignoring price and getting property? Oh, yes, I did. And yes, I'm also going to suggest to you that you change your thinking on the way that you actually do view price. But all of that said, it doesn't mean that we don't need to bring the owner's expectation down to facilitate the buyers putting proposals in front of them that allow them to get on with their plans. Now, quite simply, in making this quantum leap, Bo, I know that you've just got a message from your mate. That's okay. I know you've got to get away, but stick this one in the cap and you can come back and review this later. The key, the secret to moving from 3 or 4 listings a month up to double-figure listings is focus. You see, I say quite simply, what you focus on grows. If you focus on everything going to shit, it typically will go to shit. If you focus on winning listings, that's what you'll do. If you focus on getting prospects all the time, that's what you'll get. And of course, if you focus on listings fundamentally, that's what you'll get too. And I really do need to explain that. You see, there's lots of things inside the real estate transaction that we simply have no control over. We try to control them, but we don't have any affirmative or positive control. You simply cannot control, for argument's sake, buyer sentiment. If buyer sentiment is such that inquiry is down, that's just the way it is. If sales aren't occurring because fiscal policy is being introduced that's making it difficult for the number of sales to turn over, that too can present a problem. If your competition is lowering prices down to a level that make it difficult for you to compete with them, this can also present a problem. So there's lots of variables inside the real estate transaction, and I'll just hold on that one. I'll come back to variables in a moment as it relates to price. But there's lots of variables that are beyond your control. So there is, here's the admission, there is such thing as a sales slump. But there is no such thing as a listing slump. You see, a listing slump, if you're having one, is self-imposed. Self-imposed in the fact that you're not focused upon it. And given that the only part of the real estate transaction that you can control is listings, then that should be your primary focus. So we say the solution to every problem inside of List and Sell, inside of Steam, inside of Corporate Real Estate Manager, we're constantly saying it's always the solution is to get more listings. If you control listings, you control your outcomes in this business. So there's no such thing as a listing slump. So for that reason, I say to you that listing always comes before selling. So the key in going to a quantum leap is not just talking about that focus, it's living it. So what I say to salespeople, and I've done this for a number of years, the key is to make sure that you're doing a listing presentation every single day, preferably to active property sellers, sellers that are selling right now. Now, I know that that's easy for me to roll that off the tongue, and for you sitting there, it sounds like it's hard to do, but not if you're focused upon it. Not if you have an absolute focus upon it. Listing always comes before selling. In the last recording I did here, I talked about, leveraging off the front end of a listing. That comes from that focus. So when I talk about having a listing presentation every day, I'd like to say to you that maintaining this focus starts the day before. You should never leave a real estate office without having a listing appointment set for the next day that you're in the office. That's how you maintain the focus. That's how you set yourself on the path to double-figure listings. And that's how you make a quantum leap across to double-figure listings. All right, so how does this relate to the overpricing issue? Let's get into that, because I think that becomes interesting. Now, I just want to talk about market value versus comparative value, and I'll start with giving you an example of that illustrates this, in my opinion, perfectly. You see, I see the waters are very, very muddied between the two. I see salespeople referring to market value when they're really talking about comparative value, and vice versa. Have you ever listed a property? Here's the example. Have you ever listed a property? You're walking out of the house, you've got the listing agreement with you, you've won the business, and you're walking down the footpath to your car, and your shoulders just slump, and you hope they're not looking, and you just think to yourself, this is a dog with fleas. It is literally a noose around my neck. I will never sell this property at this price. You do that, but within 3 or 4 days, a buyer appears, and not only do they agree to buy it having fallen in love with it, they pay a price that completely floors you. Now, what do? Well, we don't sit there, throw our hands in the air in disgust and say, that's it, I give up, I don't get this real estate industry. We kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, look how good I am, and we can't wait to tell the world how we were able to sell this property that was seemingly almost impossible. Conversely, have you ever walked down that same driveway with another listing and thought you don't want the owners to be looking at you because you just want to jump in the air and click your feet? Or punch down, you're just thinking, money in the bank. This is out the door. You're almost counting the commission. And then 6 months later, the property is still there. You cannot get anyone interested in it, and it's set at a price that you believe is absolutely fabulous. Now, this has happened to all of us at various times. What I say to salespeople is this: what did you learn from it? Because see, I'd like to suggest to you that what you've just experienced is market value in play. And you see, this seems to me to have been the forgotten thing about the real estate business. Now, I've been in this game for 30 years, and I can tell you, back in the late 80s, when people came into the real estate office and asked us, property sellers, what their property might be worth, it was a legitimate question because they could not source this information anywhere else other than with estate agents. And for that matter, we struggle with it too because the information wasn't exchanged between agents as a result, so we only really had the numbers that we had to go on. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So we'd be out there and they'd ask us what the property is worth, and I've got to tell you, by and large, we'd pretty much make it up. We had a fair idea, but we would just lift it up. So if you gave them a number and their eyes dropped down, you just keep going up in price till their eyes lit up, and they gave you a crack at it, and you'd list it, and you'd walk down that driveway, and you wouldn't think it's overpriced or otherwise. You'd start saying to yourself, how do I make it worth this? So I just want to give you an analysis and a quick understanding. You see, comparative value, and I see this whole industry of late in the last decade has a complete preoccupation with comparative market analysis, with prices that have been achieved, and we keep constantly saying as real estate agents that the property's only worth that amount of money because that's what the comparisons are suggesting. Yet, I just gave you that example of market value, and you're seeing that it completely conflicts with it. So here's the rub. Here's where we get right down to tin tacks about this. Comparative value is not much more than a benchmark. It is a realistic indication of value based upon facts, things that have happened. Now, when you go to a listing presentation, given that this comparative value, if I'm going to put it into words, is the realistic value, it's based on reality, yeah? I would ask you, what disposition are the property sellers you're talking to in? Are they in a realistic disposition, or are they in a disposition of optimism? Now, you and I both know that the latter is true. So what I like to do is entertain their optimism without giving them any absolutes, and I explain the difference between the two. You see, most property sellers, when you get down to see them, already know what the comparative value is, because these days they're conducting their own research prior to putting the property on the market. So it really shouldn't be an issue in relation to the listing of the property. Yet, there are many sellers that are choosing agents, unfortunately, based upon the price they quote, coupled with the fee they charge. Now, if you want to play this game, if you want to continue to play this game, be my guest. But this is why you're being subjected to fee challenges. Great agents make this statement, and they make it very simply. You see, it's not our job to calculate the worth of a property. It's our job, instead, to create value. Marketers aren't interested in what is, they are interested in what can be. You see, market value, on the other hand, is based upon a whole range of variables, and these variables are so numerous that it's some of which are totally beyond your control, but many which are totally within the realms of your control, and you can manipulate them. So there's things that we mentioned earlier on when I talked about those variables. You can't control buyer sentiment. You can't really control supply and demand to any great lengths. You can't control fiscal policy. You can't control, lending policy, what banks are doing with interest rates, that sort of thing. You can't control someone's financial disposition. So these things make it difficult. But what you can control are three very, very particular facets, and these have a direct correlation to market value. First and foremost, you can control marketing. Now, marketing is about creating perceptions so that those perceptions for that property owner become their reality. What do I mean by that? Well, manipulating the presentation, manipulating the way the property is advertised in any form of marketing. Creating a perception that becomes a reality for a buyer. Now, that's a whole subject on its own, and I could go on about that for days on end. Now, what I say to real estate salespeople is I'm not talking about selling marketing or that horrible acronym of vendor paid advertising. I'm talking about investing in not just marketing, but the seller investing in a marketer, somebody who knows how to manipulate perceptions to their advantage and create those value parameters. Which leads me to the second facet of what we're able to manipulate, and quite readily. And that is the ability, our ability as negotiators. Negotiator. Yep. Your understanding of how to create value parameters in the mind of the property seller. Importantly, your understanding of how to, once you've established that that buyer wants that property, to cleverly start to take it away from them and make them fight for it. You see, what I talk about, and like just even language stuff that I see salespeople make mistakes with in negotiation. I see them say to buyers, what do you think? Buyers should not be thinking. The language always should be with a buyer. How do you feel about this property? How do you feel about the location? Do you feel like you can make it your home? So what I do with buyers, I match them to a property they want to make their home. I then start to withdraw it from them, and then I make them fight for it, and I allow them to feel their way home. Now, this is what a great negotiator does, and quite frankly, it's a variable and also represents something that sellers cannot do for themselves. The same with marketing. The third wheel, the third cog in the wheel, is that of a communicator. Now, communication is not what you say, it's what's understood by what you say. And who better to communicate an understanding of the difference between market value and comparative value other than an estate agent? You see, I wish listing presentations weren't titled as such. I wish they were actually called a listing education, because I believe it's our industry's responsibility to educate property sellers how to identify better salespeople. By identifying better salespeople, the sellers are getting a better result. Ours is the only industry in the world where if the sellers were wise enough to be able to identify the best salesperson, then they will have made the most economical choice. Quite literally, over the years, I've sold properties for people, and I can tell you beyond any shadow of a doubt, by comparison to other agents, they got my services for free, yet I was the most expensive choice they could have made. So communication makes a very, very big impact on where we go with price. So you see, at the end of the day, the CMA is based upon reality. And whilst reality will play a role, it really only plays a role once we've exhausted the possibilities. And this is the space that great salespeople live in. Salespeople don't look at an article and say, what's it worth? Salespeople look at an article and say, how can I make it worth X amount of dollars? Salespeople lock in to the motive of a seller, understand what the seller is trying to do, and then do everything within their power to ensure that that seller is able to fulfill that initial motivation they had to sell the property in the first place. So summing it up, in a simple line, I say this to you. Market value is not based upon reality. That's comparative value. Comparative value is not much more than a benchmark, and it's a realistic understanding of where the property might sit inside a certain value parameter. Market value, on the other hand, is based upon possibilities, and those possibilities are greatly enhanced when you introduce a true sales professional. So comparative worth, stop calculating it, stop getting hung up on it. And when you're explaining this to a seller, when you're in the confines of a listing presentation, I look to the seller and I say to them, when they ask me what the property's worth, I tell them honestly, I say, look, really, I don't know. And they say, what do you mean? Well, I can tell you what the comparative value perhaps is, but my guess is that you already are across that. You will have done some research and you have a fair handle on where the property sits comparatively. And if my guess would be that you don't feel that optimistic about it. You see, I see it as my role to leverage your value beyond comparison. And at the end of the day, leveraging that value beyond comparison is based upon what might be possible. And I'd like to explore those options with you. But at the very same time, I want to ensure that there is no chance, nil chance whatsoever of you being undersold by virtue of the fact that somebody gets too hung up on comparative value. So if it's okay with you, I want to leave this CMA that I have here for you in the bag at this point in time, and instead explore the possibilities of where we might be able to leverage that value too. And there's 3 ways that we can do this. The first is through marketing. Now, I'm not talking about advertising. I'm not talking about a great big expense. I'm talking about creating a perception that captures the imagination of the right buyer and they see a greater value inside the property. I want to show you or demonstrate to you how it is when I do find that buyer, I'm able to leverage their perception of the value or the parameter of value into a space that might even surprise you. And thirdly, I want to demonstrate to you how I do that inside the communication techniques. If we work on this together, Mr. Seller, I know that you have a clear understanding of what you want. I know what I want. So why don't we put our heads together right now and come up with a devilish plan to roll a buyer for it. If you get this understanding across to sellers, you will be able to remove this idea where they're looking at you and saying, what's it worth? And then right after you give them that number, if it doesn't match, and I'm sure some of you have been through this situation where you start to talk about comparative value and it's almost as though you have to guess how many marbles they have in the jar, and you sometimes feel if you don't guess where their head's at on comparative price, you'll lose the job. You see, once you understand market value, once you understand that a world of possibilities is open to you, and you capture the imagination of the seller around that, you will have not only a client that's willing to pay your fee that you might set fairly and the right incentive, but also you'll have a client that is quite cooperative inside the transaction. I am firmly of the opinion that there has been a distinct lack of salespeople or sales skills in the industry over the last 20 years. Now, that's not a criticism, that's not me on the attack, it's just that we seem to have forgotten it. The information age, unfortunately, has caused us to lean way too heavily toward data and its realistic role. Well, inside the real estate transaction, which is an emotional purchase, and people are buying homes, I can tell you that you can, on behalf of your sellers, exploit these emotions to their advantage. And this can only be achieved if we start to focus on the skills that are available to us and the power that we have available to us to manipulate marketing perceptions, to manipulate value parameters through negotiation skill, and then improve our communication skills so that we are literally teaching property sellers how to identify better salespeople. We're teaching them how to make decisions for better agents. So there it is. I hope that, Bo, that one clears it up for you. I will be very sure to put a link onto Bo's video where he's in the bathtub and how that might be bringing more listing presentations across. I hope that everyone's enjoying. I'm going to continue to do these. It seems that the feedback has just been sensational on these. So you are truly encouraged, whether it be on the return of the salesperson or through any of our other channels, the List and Sell Army, List and Sell Implementer. Please jot your question down. We'll grab hold of it. We'll feed it back to you. We'll let you know that it's going to be put on air. So once again, I say to you people, ask Mark anything. I'm here to give you the answers that I can find to the puzzle of real estate sales. Thanks for joining.